Why do the dead always seem to leave their front doors unlocked? What happens to the air in a room right before a throat is cut? And why does it smell so distinctly of winter copper? If the shadows in these woods aren't yours, then whose feet are making the dry pine needles snap 20 paces behind you? The beam of Michael Anderson's Sony FX3 cut through the Oregon mist like a silver blade, illuminating nothing but the endless, suffocating geometry of Douglas firs. At 27, Michael still possessed the reckless, stubborn bravery of a young filmmaker who believed a lens could act as a shield between himself and reality. He had spent the last 3 years chasing urban legends across the Pacific Northwest. But Whisper Woods was different. The locals in the diner 40 miles back hadn't warned him away with dramatic, cinematic threats. They had simply looked at his camera rig, paid for their coffee, and walked out, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. The rumors were sparse but absolute. People walked into these woods to find the old Blackwood estate, and the woods simply swallowed the path behind them. The night air was crisp, initially holding the clean, resinous scent of wet earth and pine, a normal autumn midnight in the high country. Michael checked his audio levels, the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the forest floor registering as a steady green bar on his monitor. He spoke into his lapel mic, his voice steady, carrying the practiced, grounded cadence of a professional investigator. Midnight, October 14th. We're roughly 3 miles off the logging trail. The terrain is dense, but there's a clear, unnatural clearing ahead where the canopy breaks. If the 1974 county surveys are correct, the Blackwood homestead should be directly beyond this ridge. As he crested the rise, the normal forest sounds, the distant lonely hoot of a spotted owl, the skittering of small nocturnal animals through the brush, died with an abruptness that made his ears pop. The silence that replaced it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, pressurized, like the atmosphere inside a diving bell. Michael stopped, his boots sinking into the damp moss. He pulled up his phone to check his GPS coordinates, but the screen was a chaotic jitter of static, the battery icon violently dropping from 80% to 3%, then blinking out entirely. The red recording light on his camera remained lit, but the audio monitor suddenly spiked into the red, registering a high-pitched subsonic whine that made his molars ache. Then came the signs. The trees here didn't grow straight. They twisted away from a central point in the valley below. Their trunks warped into agonizing spiral shapes as if fleeing an unseen heat. Nailed to the bark of a massive dead cedar were 3 rusted iron horseshoes, all pointed downward, an old frontier curse meant to keep luck from ever rising from the soil. Beneath them, carved deep into the wood, was a single word repeated over and over, until the bark was nothing but splintered pulp. Hush. Michael felt a cold drop of sweat trace a slow line down his spine. The bravery that had carried him through haunted asylums and abandoned mines began to curdle into an instinctual, animalistic urge to turn around. But the camera was an addiction, and the mystery of the Blackwood family, a wealthy timber lineage that had vanished overnight in the winter of 1963, leaving their dinner tables set and their fires burning, was too perfect a story to abandon. He pushed forward, the beam of his flashlight cutting through a sudden, dense wall of ground fog that smelled faintly of rotten vinegar. The house materialized out of the mist like a listing shipwreck. It was a massive 3-story Victorian Gothic structure, its timber blackened by decades of rain and rot. The architecture was frantic, a madness of gables, narrow dormer windows that looked like squinting eyes, and a wraparound porch that sagged into the earth like a broken jaw. It shouldn't have been standing. The weight of the winter snows should have crushed it 50 years ago, yet it loomed, dominant and predatory, against the starless Oregon sky. As Michael stepped onto the perimeter of the overgrown lawn, the silence broke. A low, rhythmic rasping sound echoed from the dark tree line to his left. It sounded like a heavy canvas sack being dragged across gravel. He swung his camera toward the noise. The lens caught the tops of the ferns bending under an invisible weight, a path clearing itself through the brush toward him. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice betraying the first crack of genuine fear. "I'm armed. I'm just making a film." The dragging sound stopped. From the darkness just beyond the reach of his light, a voice answered. It wasn't a scream or a monstrous growl. It was a soft, airy whisper that sounded exactly like his mother's voice, a woman currently sitting in a well-lit apartment in Portland. "Michael, you didn't wear your coat, Mikey. It's going to get so cold." The sheer wrongness of the sound sent a spike of pure adrenaline through his veins. His mother hadn't called him Mikey since he was 6. Panic, cold and sharp, overrode his professional detachment. He didn't run back into the woods. The path behind him was now shrouded in a fog so thick it looked like solid white marble. So he ran forward, lunging up the rotting steps of the porch. His heavy boot struck the front door, and to his horror, the massive oak portal didn't creak open. It swung inward with a smooth, silent fluidity, as if the hinges had been freshly oiled an hour ago. He threw himself inside and slammed the door shut behind him. The heavy iron bolt on the door slid into place with a loud mechanical clack. Michael spun around, his flashlight beam raking across the grand entryway. The interior of the Blackwood house was pristine. There was no dust, no cobwebs, no signs of the half-century of abandonment that should have decayed the structure. The air was warm, smelling of wood smoke, roasted vanilla, and old paper. A grandfather clock stood against the far wall, its heavy brass pendulum swinging back and forth with a deafening, hypnotic tick-tock, tick-tock. "Hello?" Michael whispered, backing away from the locked door. The house didn't answer with words, but the ambient temperature dropped instantly, his breath blooming into white plumes before his face. He held up his camera, using the small screen to scan the walls of the long hallway. The walls were lined with framed oval photographs, the sepia-toned portraits of the Blackwood family. There was Arthur Blackwood, the stern patriarch, his wife, Eleanor, and their 2 young daughters, Abigail and Clara. Michael approached a portrait of the 2 girls. They were dressed in stiff, lace Victorian dresses, staring into the camera with blank, unblinking expressions. As Michael watched through his digital viewfinder, the pixels on the screen began to swim. The faces of the girls in the photograph didn't just blur, they shifted. Abigail's eyes slowly rolled back into her head until only the white sclera showed, and Clara's mouth stretched downward, opening into an impossible, cavernous black void that reached past her chin. Michael lowered the camera, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked directly at the physical photograph on the wall. The girls were normal again, staring at him with their pale, somber eyes. But when he raised the camera back to his eye, the digital display showed the girls pressing their faces against the inside of the glass, their fingers smeared with dark grease, their lips moving in silent, frantic screams. "Help us. Help us. He's hungry." The camera began to vibrate in his hands, the plastic casing growing burning hot. He dropped it, the expensive rig clattering onto the plush Persian rug. It didn't break. Instead, the lens remained pointed toward the ceiling, capturing the heavy crystal chandelier above beginning to spin. Slowly at first, then faster and faster until the glass crystals shrieked against each other like grinding teeth. Michael backed away, his boots sinking into the rug, which suddenly felt unnaturally soft, like walking on wet, decaying meat. He turned into the nearest doorway, seeking shelter in what appeared to be the library. The moment his feet crossed the threshold, the door behind him didn't just slam, it vanished. Where the doorway had been, there was now only a solid wall of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, packed with leather-bound volumes whose titles were written in a language he couldn't recognize. Characters that seemed to twist and squirm like worms when he tried to focus on them. The room was circular, illuminated by a faint amber glow from a fireplace that contained no wood, only a pile of glowing white ash that pulsed like a heartbeat. In the center of the room sat a small mahogany writing desk. On it lay a leather journal, its pages yellowed and frayed, and a small porcelain doll dressed in a faded blue gingham dress. The doll's eyes were made of cracked glass, staring blankly at the wall. Michael, drawn by a morbid, irresistible curiosity that felt less like his own will and more like a heavy hand pressing against the back of his skull, approached the desk. He reached out and opened the journal. The handwriting was elegant, but became progressively erratic, the ink changing from black to a dark, rusty brown that had dried in thick, raised ridges on the paper. It was the diary of Eleanor Blackwood, dated December 1963. December 4th. Arthur says the trees are speaking a truer English than we do. He spends his nights in the cellar, listening to the floorboards. He says the house is a lung, and we are the breath it needs to keep from freezing.